Our cells and their products come together, forming 4 primary tissue types. Epithelial tissues cover and line the body. Connective tissues support the body. Nervous tissue allows for communication, and muscle tissue allows for movement. Epithelial tissue covers body surfaces, lines cavities, and forms glands. There's many different types of epithelial tissue, and each has its own kind of specified or specialized function. But those functions include protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, secretion, and sensory reception. Even though there's many different types of epithelium, they all share certain characteristics. That first characteristic that they share is called polarity. Polarity means that there's a difference between one surface of the cells compared to another surface of the cells. And so here we have different examples of epithelium. But one thing that you see is that all epithelium has a free surface on one side and a surface that has a membrane underneath it on the other side. The free surface is called the apical surface, right? So this is the apical surface. And the part of the epithelium that touches the membrane is the basal surface. You'll also notice that these cells are continuous, right? And they form essentially sheets of tissue. So that is another characteristic of epithelium, that they form continuous sheets. Cells that are next to each other are held together by specialized contacts, including desmosomes and tight junctions. All epithelial tissue is supported by what's called a basement membrane, and the basement membrane is underneath these cells, so this kind of dark purple here. And while these illustrations do not show it, the basement membrane is actually formed of 2 different layers. One is called the basal lamina, the other is the reticular lamina. The basal lamina is secreted from the epithelial cells, and the reticular lamina is secreted by the connective tissue underneath. You'll see that I talk more about that in the lab video. It has nerves that go through to the epithelium, but it's avascular, meaning that there's no blood vessels. So epithelial tissue is innervated, meaning that it has nerves that travel to it, but it is avascular, so there's no blood that travels directly to the epithelium. And it has a really high regeneration capacity, so lots of mitosis going on in epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is classified by the number of layers of cells and by the shape of cells. So if it's a single layer, it's called simple, and if it's multiple layers, it's called stratified. If the cells are scale-like, they're called squamous. If they're cube-like, they're cuboidal, and if they are column-like, they're columnar. Okay. We also have this tissue over here, which is called pseudostratified columnar. So it's still columnar cells. And you can see by looking at the basement membrane, the attachment at the basal and basement membrane, that it's just a single layer of cells, but it kind of looks like it might be 2 layers. And so that's why it's called pseudo-stratified, because it's false stratified. Okay? Each different type of epithelium is kind of specialized for a different job. So simple squamous tissue is found where filtration or exchange of substances occurs. So we see this in the lungs. Okay? Simple cuboidal is going to form the ducts of the kidneys, and simple cuboidal is good at absorbing and secreting substances. Simple columnar is found along the digestive tract, again, absorbs nutrients and produces secretions. When we look at stratified epithelium, this is it's the stratified squamous epithelium. We see it on our skin, we see it in our esophagus, we see it in areas that are likely to get scraped, cut up. And so stratified squamous epithelium is for protection. Okay? We can find stratified cuboidal in the ducts of certain glands. Stratified columnar we find in the pharynx and the male urethra. And the pseudostratified columnar we find in many different places, but the one that we're going to look at in lab is within the trachea. There's one more special type of epithelium that I don't have a picture of here, but it's called transitional epithelium. And transitional epithelium kind of looks like a stratified cuboidal epithelium when it's not stretched out, but it can get stretched and look almost like simple squamous epithelium. And the transitional epithelium is only found in the urinary system, so found in the ureters and the bladder and the urethra. Epithelial tissue also folds in, forming glands. We have two different types of glands in our body. We have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are ductless glands that secrete hormones by exocytosis directly into blood or lymph. Exocrine glands have ducts, and they secrete their products onto the surface of the body or into body cavities. And so I haven't mentioned this to you yet, but when you think of the body, you can think of us as a highly convoluted straw from mouth to anus. So everything in the GI tract is actually open to the external world. So digestive enzymes or what have you are going to be secreted by exocrine glands into the GI tract. Okay? Some of those exocrine glands are going to be unicellular. Okay, and so a unicellular gland is going to secrete through the linings of the cell, or the cell membrane. And so one of the best examples that you'll see in lab is a goblet cell. And a goblet cell secretes something called mucin that turns into mucus. So that's an example of a unicellular exocrine gland. There are multicellular exocrine glands, and that's kind of what we see in this picture. And they consist of a duct, secretory cells, and they have varied structures, right? So some of these glands are very simple. We have these very simple unbranched ducts over here. And then we have the kind of really complex branch ducts over here. So that is one way that these multicellular exocrine glands are classified, by whether they are simple or branched. Another way that they're classified is by the way that they secrete their products. So merocrine glands are going to release their products through exocytosis. And so the sweat glands that we find from head to toe are merocrine glands. They secrete sweat by exocytosis. There's holocrine glands, which release their product when the cell ruptures. And then there's apocrine glands, and apocrine glands release the product from the apical side of the cell. And when it releases the product, some of the cellular proteins come with it. And so with apocrine glands, you end up with not only the secretion, but a lot of cellular debris. Okay, so the sweat glands in our armpits and in our groin that become active during puberty are considered apocrine glands. Our next tissue type that we're going to look into is connective tissue. Connective tissue is by far the most abundant tissue in the body. It's found surrounding organs, layered within organs, underlying epithelial tissue, so it's just found everywhere. And there's a really great diversity in connective tissue. All connective tissue has some common characteristics, though. So the first one is that during development, all connective tissue arises from this embryonic tissue that's called mesenchyme. Okay? Connective tissue can be avascular or highly vascularized, and it's composed mostly of a non-living extracellular matrix. So there's some cells here. Here's a cell, here are some cells, here are some cells. But everything else you see is this non-living extracellular matrix. And this non-living extracellular matrix is made up of ground substance. Ground substance is kind of like, you can kind of think of it as jello, right? It's kind of a suspension that holds proteins, proteoglycans, protein fibers. And then we have the actual fibers themselves. So within connective tissue, we find collagen fibers. Collagen fibers provide strength for the tissue. Elastic fibers allow for the tissue to stretch. And reticular fibers form networks within the tissue. Okay? So that extracellular matrix that's made out of ground substance and fibers is found in all connective tissue. The other characteristics is that there tends to be a lot of space around the cells. Okay, and we're going to see that when we study the different types of connective tissue in lab. There are many different types of tissues, and I'm not going to spend much time on that now, but I'm going to tell you that there's what we call connective tissue proper, and connective tissue proper includes loose connective tissues such as adipose tissue or fat, and dense connective tissue. And a good example of dense connective tissue is like a ligament or tendon. The remaining connective tissues are considered special connective tissues, and they are things like cartilage, bone, and blood. The next tissue that we're going to look at is muscle tissue. And muscle tissue, whether it's skeletal, cardiac, or smooth muscle, is responsible for movement. All muscle tissue is highly cellular. It has very good blood supplies, and it has the ability to shorten or contract. Here we have examples of skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. The skeletal muscle, you can see that there's these lines going through them called striations. A skeletal muscle cell is very long, so here these pinkish purple lines indicate a cell, each cell, and they have more than one nucleus, so they're called multinucleate. Here's a cell, here's a nucleus, here's a nucleus, and they're all parallel. Okay, they're very neat and orderly. I'm going to hop down to the cardiac muscle because you can see how this might be confused. The cardiac muscle also is striated, but cardiac muscle only has one nucleus per cell. And cardiac muscle cells are not nice, neat, parallel cells. They branch all over the place, okay? And so when you study the heart, you'll understand why there's so much branching in a cardiac muscle cell. Smooth muscle does not have the striations that we see in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle has a single nucleus and is kind of spindle shaped. Okay. The last type of tissue that we're going to talk about is nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is specialized to either send messages or to support the sending of messages. Nervous tissue is made of neurons, which are the communicating cells, and their support cells, which are called neuroglial cells. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to go over all the different types of neuroglial cells. Right now, you just need to know that nervous tissue is made out of neurons, which send messages, and neuroglial cells, which support the neurons. Okay? When we're looking at organs, I think it's important to know what layers you should expect. So if you were to cut into an organ and look at the walls of the organ, the outside and the inside would both have epithelial tissue. Underneath the epithelial tissue, we'd find connective tissue. And within the connective tissue, we would find nervous tissue and muscle tissue. Okay? So whenever we look at a slide or we look at an illustration of an organ, just remember that the outermost layers are going to be epithelium. Typically, if we're looking at a hollow organ, the inner layer is also epithelium. And then the tissue between those two epithelial layers will be connective tissue that has both nervous and muscle tissue kind of embedded within it. We're going to wrap up this section by talking about tissue repair. So all different tissues have different abilities to repair themselves. But there's a general process that's similar in the tissues that can repair themselves. So here we see this tissue has a cut in it, right? And when a cut happens, the damaged cells and tissues send out chemicals that are going to tell the body that this area needs special attention, right? So it leads to inflammation, redness, heat, lots of fluid going to the area, swelling, more blood cells going to an area than normal. Okay, so all of these things are going to help to prepare the area for repair. The white blood cells are going to clean up any debris. The fluid also helps the white blood cells clean up debris. The fluid also prevents the area from moving too much. And all of this is so that the next step can start happening, which is granulation tissue. Granulation tissue is tissue that restores blood supply to the area, right? And as that's happening, the epithelial cells start to divide and kind of fill in until they meet, until the two edges meet. Okay? If something cannot regenerate, you end up with scar tissue. Okay? So just going over this again, this first step is inflammation. That damaged area is going to release inflammatory chemicals that cause inflammation, redness, swelling, heat, increased blood delivery. Okay? Then the next step is called organization. And organization is when granulation tissue develops in the area to restore blood supply to the damaged tissue. And the third step is regeneration and or fibrosis. So regeneration is for when the same tissue reforms, and fibrosis is when scar tissue reforms. When we're looking at regeneration ability or regeneration capacity, cardiac muscle and nervous tissue have virtually no ability to regenerate. Skeletal muscle and cartilage can regenerate a little bit, but it's not super great. The cartilage doesn't regenerate very well because there's no blood supply. Skeletal muscle doesn't regenerate very well because of just, all the organization that's involved with skeletal muscle. Tissue that generates a little bit better is smooth muscle, dense regular connective tissue. And then the tissue that's going to regenerate the best includes epithelial tissue. Remember, they're highly mitotic, so it's no problem just filling in those gaps. Bone, when we break a bone, it heals pretty easily. About a year and a half later, there's very little evidence of broken bone. Areolar connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue also regenerate pretty well. So you may not know all those subtypes just yet, but when you look into the lab video, you will. I hope this introduction to tissues helps with your focus outline this week and helps you understand the topics that we're studying.